So during the reception this afternoon, I discovered that within this relatively homogeneous group gathered today, since all of us are EIFs, there was one distinction which was relatively easy to discover. And that is, you will find, if you try this later on, strike up a discussion about the weather with anyone standing near to you. And I will predict that if their reply is, wow, I can't wait for it to rain, it looks like it could any moment, I hope, that person is from Los Angeles. If they say, oh my gosh, I hope it does not start raining until tomorrow, they are from Williamstown. So I'm tempted to ask, but the lighting is such, I don't think I will. How many of you can answer this on your own, how many of you would say that you feel overall public schools in America are improving or have improved over the last 50 years? And I wonder how many of you would say you think they have not improved? How many of you would say they've gotten worse? And I bet that most of you will be surprised to see the following data. Now, of course, as we all know, as we teach our very first year doctoral students, there are two kinds of people in the world. One kind of person believes that data are your friend, they will guide you and show you the way. Those people are fools. The other kind of person believes that although you cannot do without them, data are your enemy, and they will deceive you and trick you at every turn, and you can never turn your back on them for a moment. Those people have a chance. So there are lots of ifs, ands, or buts, but all I can say is that the basic conclusion is that you could argue just about either way, but I will show you one more set of data which are not quite so easy to regard as having completely ambiguous meaning. And you might not be surprised. You would be surprised if I showed you this is the most credible set of data we have available, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is run by the federal government with a small sample. The sample is roughly 4,000 students per state. And the idea is not to test enough students to permit anyone to evaluate individual schools or compare them, because that would be an intrusion by the federal government into educational policy, which in our country is the province of the states. So they keep the sample small enough that you can use it to evaluate what's happening overall in a state, but nothing finer than that. All of the other tests are subject to horrible, almost intentional manipulation. Virtually every governor changes to a new standardized test in his or her first year in office because they know that the first year of the new test, and all of these are published by a big publishing company which also publishes practice tests and teacher instructional books and all manner of devices which essentially allow you to teach the students what's going to be on the test probably next time around. So the first year of a new test, students will do poorly, and then every following year during that governor's 2 terms in office, performance will rise. You can't do that with the NAEP because the NAEP does not permit the sale of any such material, so it's the most reliable test. If you look at the NAEP for 4th and 8th grade students, those have increased. Those readings in math and literacy have increased steadily over the same period. But there are so many explanations for that and so many theories, and the fighting is more vicious over interpretations of standardized testing than over almost anything else in the world of education. But there's consensus on these results in high schools, which is that it's been devilishly difficult to get the needle to move. Now, I would say that the one very important distinction that most lay people don't make and that I've learned about and which I find to be compelling is a distinction that we just saw in our first presentation, which is between the standards, or in this case, the Common Core, as a set of standards for defining what it is students should be able to master at each grade level in each subject area. And on the other hand, what I will call curriculum, which is the means by which teachers seek to achieve that goal with their students. So any set of standards, the Common Core, for example, can be taught by one teacher using what we might call project-based instruction, in which the students will execute a 4-month-long project and then another 4-month-long project, while another teacher will seek to achieve the same objective results by having the students sit behind their desks and receive direct instruction from the teacher each day. So as you can see, an infinite number of different ways to have a curriculum, all of which can be directed at a common standard. Now, this is a source of great confusion, as you'll see as we go along in a moment. I think that's an important distinction. But one other distinction is that there is a huge difference in this country in the funding per student. And it's a subject that's not often talked about. It's once an uncomfortable topic for many people. In the state of New York, although there have been legal challenges of late, it has been the practice that counties raise educational funds by assessing property taxes, and then the school budget per student is based on the collections from the residents of the county of those schools. And one result is that in Westchester County, the schools spend on the average $34,000 per student per year. And in the urban areas of New York, whether those be Albany, Troy, or New York City, they spend less than half that amount per student. That used to be the case in California until we had a California Supreme Court decision which found that result to be unconstitutional and ruled that all of those tax revenues must be collected up in Sacramento and then redistributed across the state of California on an equal per capita per student basis. Sounds equitable, sounds fine. I think it probably is. However, what they didn't realize was that when all the money arrived in San Francisco, the people who were in charge of dispersing it followed the golden rule. He who controls the gold makes the rules. And a little bit of the gold stuck to their fingers every time. And their staffs up in Sacramento got bigger and bigger. And not only that, they concluded that they knew much more about education than did the people who just fell off the turnip truck in Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco. So soon they were promulgating rule after rule after rule and embodying each rule in a set of spending restrictions, which they labeled, what's the name for it now? Anyway, they were specialized funding categories, of which we now have 144. So now in the state of California, if you're a principal or a teacher in a school and you think you know which reading books would best serve your distinctive population of children, it doesn't matter, because the State Board of Education, in its infinite wisdom, has approved only 2 different reading series. You may use a different reading series, but you have to pay for it yourself. If you want the state to provide the books, you have to pick one of the 2 they have chosen. This, I suggest, is not an intelligent way to run a district. Now, one of the other important issues is that in the world of K-12 education, certain people get to make choices, in particular school boards, superintendents, governors, and so on, and other people don't get to make choices, notably parents and students. So here, for example, is a choice that is customarily made in schools. That is, how do you define a grade of A, or of B, or of C, or of D? And what this table shows is that if your child attends a high-income school, in order to get an A, they have to produce a test result in the 87th percentile. If they take the same test in a low-income school and they achieve a test score of 35%, they get an A. Now, you could look at this as half empty or half full. But I think that there's only one way to look at it, and that is that we have communicated an expectation to students primarily of color in low-income schools that we don't expect as much of them. They don't have to try to leap as high, learn as much, think as fast, be as competent. And when you start communicating that message in second or third grade, when students start to get grades, you are destroying much of their aspiration, probably forever. Here's another kind of choice we can make. If your child is in a high-income seventh grade classroom, here's a typical writing assignment that they will receive. Write an essay on Anne Frank. Your essay will consist of an opening paragraph which introduces the title, author, and general background of the novel. Your thesis will state specifically what Anne's overall personality is and what general psychological and intellectual changes she exhibits over the course of the book. That's not a bad essay assignment for a seventh grader. But if your seventh grade child happens to be in a low-income school, their typical essay assignment will look like this. Fill in the blanks. My best friend. A chore I hate. A car I want. Enough said. Far too many people, unfortunately, believe that we are powerless. I can't tell you, I have, over my last several years of studying schools, my research team and I, that's 11 research assistants and I, visited literally hundreds of schools and literally thousands of classrooms and interviewed tens of thousands of teachers. And I can't tell you how many teachers have said to me, what can you expect? They are the children of peasants who immigrated from a country in which formal education is not expected, is not respected, and they're always taking their children out of school because they have a tradition of the family gathering together at Christmas time, at Easter time, and they care so little about school that they take the children out for 2 weeks and they go back to their country of origin, communicating thereby a lack of respect for school. My only reply is that I've been dealing for many years with school reform, and I've talked to a whole bunch of parents, and I have yet to meet a single parent who did not care desperately that their child excel at school. They believe and they know that education is the gateway to opportunity in this great country. And every single parent wants desperately for their child to succeed in school. All of this other stuff is baloney. So I'm a simple-minded person. I spent my whole career studying big organizations. And what I know about big organizations is that they are subject to the same pathologies, and that the only hope is in a big organization is to adopt some method of decentralizing decision-making, in this case, empowering schools, and that works. And what has happened in this country over the last several decades is there's been a huge consolidation during which we have dropped from 127,000 school districts to only 13,500 school districts, while the number of students has doubled from 25 million to 50 million nearly, which means the typical school district today has an enrollment 18 times the typical district of 1932. And simply put, you cannot have an organization grow 18-fold without a fundamental change in structure and have it be able to fly. It won't. So I'll just pass quickly over that, and you have to, in every academic talk, always announce a paradigm shift. You're supposed to do it at the outset, but I couldn't figure out how to get my paradigm shift in until right now, so I apologize. But the idea here is the following. How about if we were to not fund schools at all, but instead we were to fund individuals, students? And we already know in every state in the union which child qualifies for special education or gifted and talented or English as a second language or requires occupational therapy or speech therapy. We know all that. Every student has all those tags in their folder. And so we can construct a system of weights, known not surprisingly as weighted student formula, and then the right-handed upper middle class blonde child with no learning disabilities who is the cheapest kid to educate will get the basic grant, which may be $7,000 a year. And the child who has the greatest challenge may get $30,000 a year. And then why not give the family the freedom to choose to send their child to any public district school they like, and then the money follows the child to the school. Now you have created a system that creates a motivation for schools to differentiate. They aren't all going to offer a hot dog. Some of them are going to start to offer a slice of pizza. Some are going to offer a hamburger. Some are going to put tacos on the menu. And some are going to have sushi for lunch. Now families have real choices. And when you decentralize or empower the school, principals have the means, along with their teachers, to improve their schools. So I did this. I measured this. I'm a very skeptical fellow. I don't sit down with a principal and ask them, how much decision-making authority do you have? I go through item by item and ask them, if you want to spend more or less on this item, whose approval do you need? What form do you have to fill out? We go through this whole rigmarole, and this is what we end up with. In Edmonton, Canada, in Alberta, second from the right, as you look at it from LA, Edmonton is the lowest average income urban area in the province. It is lower blue collar in its background. And Mike Strambitsky, at 35 years of age, became superintendent. He remembered very clearly how much he hated being a principal and being told in excruciating detail by the central office exactly how to run his school. So he dramatically changed the whole picture and gave his principals control over 90% of their budget. They could decide how to staff their school. They could decide if they wanted to have a tennis team or not. They could decide if they wanted to offer ballet or not. Probably the only choice they could not make was whether to have a hockey team or not. By comparison, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City told their principals in excruciating detail everything they could and could not do. Except you couldn't tell because they all lied. If you asked them how much discretion their principals had, all of those districts, Chicago, New York, and LA, asserted that principals controlled almost all the money, but it wasn't true. So finally, in weighted student formula, what happens if you, I'm out of time, but if you implement weighted student formula, what happens is that if you were to rate all the students in a district, as scholars have done, and calculate the equitable funding for each student based on their individual characteristics, and then you were to calculate within this district what percent of the students have the equitable correct amount of funding, and what percent of the students are overfunded, guess from which neighborhoods, and what percent of the students are inequitably underfunded, guess from which neighborhoods. You would find that under the traditional funding model, which everybody in the U.S. uses, and you could set a marker, well, let's say 10% within, how many are correctly funded within 10% above or below the equitable level, or you could be more strict and say what percent are funded correctly within 5% of the equitable level. And in Houston in 1999, only 49% of the students in the Houston district were equitably funded. 51% were either over or underfunded by this standard. And then Houston adopted weighted student formula in 2003, and after that change, 81% were equitably funded. In Cincinnati in 1999, only 23% were equitably funded. Almost 80% were either over or underfunded. Again, guess which ones. But after Cincinnati adopted weighted student formula in 2003, this again invented by Mike Strambitsky in Edmonton originally, 100% of those students were equitably funded. So it actually works. Now, here's just a look at what a weighted student formula looks like in Edmonton and Houston and in Seattle. There are more categories. These are just a few, for example. The standard student would get none of these additions, but if they're limited English proficient and they're in Edmonton, they get 126% of the standard amount. If they are in Houston, they get 110% and so on. The lowest special ed kid gets 199% of the basic stipend in Edmonton. The most expensive special ed student in Edmonton gets 546%. In Seattle, the maximum is 876. Districts that implement this tend to start by overfunding special ed, and as soon as they do it, they discover they have created an incentive for principals to mischaracterize their students. Not that they would do that intentionally, and so the more wise ones over time move towards the Edmonton position. So I always think I should report my sources of funding because I know I'm a human being too, and yes, I am influenced by money. So all the best I can do is tell you where I got my money, and you decide for yourselves whether to believe me or not. Thank you very much.